Hello and welcome again as we continue our study of the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Whether you're a member or a visitor, we welcome you. And if you're a visitor and would like to know more, have questions, feedback, or perhaps you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint slides that we're using, our contact information can be found at the web address that's on your screen there, www.northlexingtoncoc.org. This morning we'll be doing chapters 1 through 7 of 1 Samuel. Let's begin by turning to those chapters in the book of 1 Samuel as we start. As we see on our outline here, we're going to be talking about transition to begin with. The book of 1 Samuel overlaps somewhat with the time of the Judges and also the time of the United Kingdom when we have kings such as Saul and David and Solomon. But first we have the transition period here from one judge to another, Eli to Samuel. And that's what we'll be covering for the most part today. Samuel, the last judge of Israel, is the person that we'll be looking at most in these chapters. We have the birth of a new leader in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Of course, that's Samuel himself. And it's a special story of faith and devotion involving some dedication on the part, especially of his mother, Hannah. And we'll look at that in just a moment. First, let's get our geographical bearings. The story begins in the area of the tribe of Ephraim, as indicated by the map here. And that's where Samuel is going to be born and grow up, and near the area where he will spend much of his time while he is a judge. Here are some of the main cities that will be involved in Samuel's judgeship. Shiloh, where at one time the tabernacle was located, Bethel, Mizpah, Ramah, Gilgal, and Bethlehem. And we'll have events in all of those places throughout these chapters. We'd like to set the main characters of 1 Samuel chapter 1 first, and the locations. First of all, it's in the area known as Ephraim, as we saw on the map. One of the main characters is Samuel's father, named Elkanah, who lived in the area there of Ephraim. And then we have Hannah, his mother. We'll talk about that story in just a moment. Peninnah was also a wife of Elkanah. And Eli is the judge who is going to help to nurture Samuel, raise him to be the judge that would follow him. And Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who were unfortunately wicked. And of course, the city of Shiloh, where the tabernacle was at first, as we start our chapters today. We find the story of Hannah to be one that starts out sad and ends up with a happy ending. Samuel, unlike the other wife of Elkanah, could not have children, and that bore on her heart very heavily. Her husband Elkanah was kind to her. He loved her, tried to encourage her, and in fact gave her a double portion of that which he gave to his wife because she was special, but still she wanted to have a son. And so she made a vow. She vowed to the Lord that if he would give her a male child, that she would raise that male child, and then when he was able, she would do the tabernacle, and he would be a servant of God for the rest of his life. In other words, she would give him up to the Lord after that time period. She goes to the tabernacle regularly to sacrifice. On one occasion, she's there and she's praying intently. Eli, who is the judge at that time, sees her praying without saying anything, her lips moving, and assumes that she's intoxicated. He confronts her. She explains the story, and he said, "May the God of Israel give you the child that you're seeking," which seemed to be his encouragement, perhaps something of a promise. But after that time, Hannah goes back to her home, and she feels at peace, and she believes that a son will be born. And very soon afterwards, a son is born, the son which she promised to God in the vow that she made. So she is a loving mother. She takes care of Samuel, raises him to the point of being able to be on his own, to leave home. And then she keeps her promise by taking him back to Eli at the tabernacle to serve. His story of Samuel that we'll look at in the following chapters. One thing that might have people questioning is the fact that how could Samuel eventually become a priest when in fact his father is called Elkanah the Ephraimite from the tribe of Ephraim. And of course, all priests had to be from the tribe of Levi. Well, that's not unusual, and we would understand that the Ephraimite referred to geographical identity of Elkanah. That's where he lived. It was not unusual for priestly families from the tribe of Levi to be scattered throughout the other tribes. Whereas genealogically, he was from the tribe of Levi, and therefore Samuel was too, and qualified to be a priest, which of course he was. Now there arose the need for a new leader, and that new leader was already part of God's plan, already part of Hannah's story. In chapter 2, we find out that the need for a new leader is very pressing because Eli has gotten very, very old, and his sons are wicked. They're not the kind of leaders that should take over as the leaders of God's people. In fact, their influence and Eli's failure to do anything about it had already resulted in some bad things in Israel as far as the spiritual atmosphere. So as we see the need for a new leader, we see in verse 12 of chapter 2 that the sons of Eli were called corrupt. A couple of things specifically that we know they did. The priests were supposed to sacrifice a certain portion in a certain way. The meat sacrifices were supposed to be first have the fat eliminated from them, and the fat was offered to God. That was part of the sacrifice. And then the meat was to be boiled, and the priest would take a three-pronged hook, and he would jab that into the boiling pot of meat, and whatever stuck to it was brought out belonged to the priest. Well, the sons of Eli, Phinehas and Hophni, did not follow that. In fact, they demanded from the sacrifices that were brought when the meat was raw and the fat was on it. And in other words, they stopped the sacrifice of God from being what God had commanded because of their selfishness. They even sent servants who would threaten those who brought sacrifices and said, if you do not give us what we're asking for, we'll simply take it from you. So they were corrupt as far as the worship of God and the sacrifice to Him. They were also corrupt in a moral way. Eli finds out and confronts them about the fact that they would lay with the women at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, literally in sight of the tabernacle, and they would be committing immorality there. So too late, Eli rebukes his sons. He should have done it long before that because of their evil dealings, verse 23 tells us. And we also read that even after this, after Eli's confrontation, they did not heed the voice of their father, verse 25. And because of all this, God had rejected Eli, had rejected the possibility of his sons following after him, and had made it clear that he would be replaced, in particular to Eli. However, while all this was going on in the atmosphere of Eli and his sons, something very different was happening with young Samuel. Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child. As far as we can tell, whatever the forces may have been in his young life, they were good forces. And he was brought up serving the Lord in a very sincere way, and serving exactly as his mother Hannah had intended for him to be serving when she asked for him and then promised. We read this in verse 26, and the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor both with the Lord and men. And of course, we think about Jesus' growth as he grew in wisdom and stature and favor and with God and men. And we can't help but think that this might have suggested a very, very well-rounded growth on Samuel's part. He became the kind of person God would choose to lead his people in the role of judge and priest. As we move into chapter 3, we have the transition from Eli to Samuel. It's not going to be a painless transition. It's going to be one that brought a great deal of grief to Eli and his family, to Israel in general, and certainly Samuel would have been touched by this pain as well as he resumed the place of Eli after Eli was gone. The story that some of us may remember takes place when Samuel was sleeping one night. Eli was old. His sight, his vision was pretty much gone. And Samuel was sleeping for the night. And while Samuel was lying down, the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here am I." Now, this was preceded by 3 occasions on which Samuel heard his name, Samuel. And 3 times he went to Eli, and 3 times Eli said, I didn't call you. And after the 3rd time, Eli said, "Samuel, the next time that you hear that voice," which Eli had understood, that must be the Lord, he said, "Here am I." And that's exactly what Samuel did. And the Lord gave him a message. Now the Lord came and stood and called as at the other times, the first 3 times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant hears." And that seems to have been the attitude that Samuel had been raised with and continued with as he judged Israel. "Speak, for your servant hears." Now, God tells Samuel all the things that are going to happen to Eli. A very sad story. And Samuel doesn't want to share that with Eli the next morning, but Eli probably already has some expectation of what the message was. And he encourages Samuel to tell him, and Samuel does. And of course, the message is that some very sad things are going to happen in the life of Eli and his family because of the behavior of his sons, because Eli had not done anything about that, and because the influence on Israel in general was very, very negative. As we move into chapter 3, we find that Eli is going to be removed from the picture. Samuel is going to be recognized as the new leader of Israel. For Samuel 3, verses 19 and 20, "So Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord." Now, this is chronologically a little bit ahead of some things we're going to read in just a moment, but this is what's going to become of the situation, and we're being told here that this is what's going to happen. Samuel is going to be recognized by everybody. Perhaps a refreshing change from the behavior of Eli's sons, as they see Samuel, whom they knew to be a man of godly character, was going to take over. And he was going to be the judge, and everybody knew it from Dan to Beersheba. Dan being a city on the northern limits of Israel, and Beersheba being a city near the southern border of Israel. And so the statement is then that everybody understood Samuel is going to be our judge, our priest. He's going to be our leader. And they were glad for that. Now, following up on the transition, we see in chapter 4 the events that led to the elimination of Eli and his sons as far as their presence to assist in judging God's people. The Philistines defeated Israel in chapter 4, and it was a very, very serious defeat. When they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines. It was a one-sided victory, and the Philistines rejoiced in that, constantly during this time period being a burden on the Israelites. And they were successful here, we'll find out later, because Israel had turned to idolatry instead of letting God be their God, and God did not see that they won the battles as he had previously, and he would again later on. So after the battle is going so badly, they decide that what they need to do, rather than turn to God in repentance and get rid of idols, they decide, we need the Ark of the Covenant. If we have the Ark of the Covenant in front of us, we go out there and we'd be victorious. It was almost a superstitious view of the ark, one that even some people have today when they hear about the ark and don't understand its connection with God, which was the only source of its power. They said, let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that it may save us from the hand of our enemies. Now notice there, the Ark of the Covenant was the key. And in fact, they said, here's what's going to save us. It, referring to the Ark of the Covenant. Not God, because of his covenant with us. Not God, because we worship him as we should. Not God, because he's our only deity that we serve, because all those things weren't true for them. But rather that it may save us, as if the ark by itself had some sort of magical power, which of course it did not. Now here's a map that shows the location over to the east of the map, which unfortunately is by the view of me right now, is the city of Shiloh, making their way across there to Ebenezer, the place where the Israelites were encamped, about 20 miles or so from Shiloh, from the tabernacle where the ark was to be kept. And of course, it never should have been brought into battle. It was a mistaken idea that would help them to win. And of course, they did not win. The Philistines continued to be victorious. The soldiers of Israel were killed. And in fact, the Ark of the Covenant was lost in that battle to the Philistines, where it would stay away from Shiloh for approximately the next 20 years. Back in Shiloh, Eli was waiting. Now, remember, he was old. He was 98 years old. His eyes were so dim that he could not see. He was essentially blind. And he was sitting there on some sort of seat beside the. He was waiting for news from the battle. Evidently, he knew that the ark had been taken, and that was supposed to help him win a great victory. However, there was no victory. And after the battle was over, one of the soldiers came back, made it that 20 miles or so back to Shiloh to bring him the word. He asked what had happened. Tell me what's going on. So the messenger answered, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has been a great slaughter among the people. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. At this tragic news, both because of his sons and the loss of the ark, we find that Eli fell over backwards. In the fall, his neck was broken and he died. And so on the same day, as God had actually said, both of his sons were killed. And in fact, shortly after, Eli lost his life as well. After the ark was taken by the Philistines, it was to travel through Philistia, the area of the Philistines, through a number of places. And in many cases, not staying very long, but making its way, traveling through a number of the cities there. Once the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant, they realized that they really did not want it after all because of the trouble that it's caused. First of all, the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer. That's the place of the battle where the Israelites had met the Philistines in battle. From Ebenezer to Ashdod. Ashdod was one of the 5 major cities of the Philistines. In fact, the empire was made up, the Philistine Empire, of basically 5 city-states who had this loose connection with one another and supported one another, but were cities and countries of their own in some ways. They took it to Ashdod. When the Philistines took the Ark of God, they brought it into the temple of Dagon and set it by Dagon. Now we show an image of what Dagon may have looked like in just a moment. He was one of the primary false gods of the Philistines. And some interesting things happened when they took him in, when they took the Ark of the Covenant into the temple and set him very close to where, set it very close to where the statue of Dagon was. That was the center of their worship there. in the city of Ashdod. They move it in there, and after the first night, the next morning, they find that the statue of Dagon is laying flat on its face before the Ark of the Covenant. Well, they stand it back up. And the second night, something else even stranger happens. They go in the next morning, and the statue has again fallen. And not only has it fallen, but it has been crushed. The hands had fallen from it. The head of the statue was broken off, and so nothing was left, the scripture tells us, except for the torso. Now, here is what artists' conceptions are of what the statue may have looked like. We do know that Dagon was pictured by his followers as a combination between a man and some sort of aquatic creature, like a fish there. And that's the way he might have been pictured. And these incidents with him in the temple of Dagon caused the Philistines to be very concerned. And this started a series of situations in which people said, we don't want the Ark of the Covenant in our area. They recognized that the Ark of the Covenant was causing problems. The Bible tells us that God punished the Philistines in the city there with tumors. Something of a mound, a bump, or something like that. We don't know exactly what disease it might be equivalent to today. We don't even know that it is equivalent to a disease today. We simply know that it was a miraculous disease in that particular case because God gave it to them to punish them for taking and misusing the Ark of the Covenant and to demonstrate his power. So first of all, the Philistines say, we don't want this statue in the temple of Dagon because we've seen what's happening here. And so they moved the Ark of the Covenant outside there, somewhere in the area of the city of Ashdod. And the tumors continue. The punishment of God's continue. Tumors and death comes to the people. And so they don't want it in the city of Ashdod. They take it to the city of Ekron, which is another of the major 5 cities of the Philistines. Well, trouble continues to follow it. The people of Ekron say, we don't want the Ark of the Covenant here. We don't want these bad things happening to us. And so they send it to Gath. Well, the same thing happens there. And the people of all the Philistines are trying to figure out, what are we going to do? We've got something we don't want. It's resulting in death and sickness. How are we going to get it back to the people to whom it really belongs? And that brings us to chapter 6, which is, for the most part, the story of how the ark was returned to Israelite territory. The Philistines decided that the only thing they could do was to return it there. And along the way, they even included some sacrifices, some items made of gold in an attempt to appease who they would have considered the God of the Israelites. Here's a map that, of course, did show a while ago the Battle of Ebenezer. Notice the traveling, the course of the Ark of the Covenant as it's taken down first to the city of Ashdod, and then to Gath, and then to Ekron, and then over to Beth Shemesh, which is within the territory of Israel. They left it for the country for 7 months. Basically, just let it out of the city, and nobody wanted it close to them. Chapter 6 and verse 1. Then chapter 6 and verse 3, the Philistines said, we need to send it back to God, and we need to send along some kind of sacrifice, some kind of trespass offering. We need to make right what's been done wrong here so God will quit punishing us. So they sent it to Beth Shemesh, a city which contained Israelites, God's people. However, they were glad to get it back, but unfortunately, some of them looked inside of it to see what was inside of it, which they were not supposed to do. And the text tells us that over 70,000 people died there in the area, Beth Shemesh, and the area around there. So they called the people of Kiriath Jearim, also on the map there, the final destination, at least for a while, of the Ark of the Covenant. And they said, come and get it. We don't want the Ark of the Covenant here either. And so it was taken to Beth Shemesh. There was a priest by the name of Eli Eleazar, and they said the text says he was consecrated, and he took control or ownership or temporary ownership of the Ark of the Covenant in a proper way. Sacrifices were offered. In other words, God's Ark of the Covenant was being treated in a manner that was being honored as it should have been. And then the results of death and destruction and disease ceased. Unfortunately, the ark was to stay there in Kirjath Jearim for approximately 20 years until eventually, and we'll read about that later as our story continues, David finally came and got it, and it was taken to the city of Jerusalem to be there in the temple. But it was not to return to the tabernacle in Shiloh, even though Shiloh was continuing to be the place of the tabernacle. So that's basically the events of 1 Samuel chapter 6. Now, as we move to chapter 7, we find that Israel repents and defeats the Philistines. There's going to be another battle. And this time, not only is there going to be a very different attitude on the part of God's people, the Israelites, but there's also going to be a very different outcome. And of course, those two things go together. We also notice that a key to this was the leadership. And the leadership, of course, was not from the two wicked sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, who were now deceased, but rather it was from Samuel, the new judge, the new priest, the new recognized leader of God's people, who was surely, at least in part, responsible for the change of attitude that God's people had and helping them to return to God, resulting also in the winning of the battle. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord, if you return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths from among you. Later on, the Baals are also mentioned because they served both of those deities as they should not have. And prepare your hearts for the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. In other words, the message that should have been obvious to them the first time, why did we lose the battle? Why did the Philistines defeat us? Well, it's because we turned our back on God, and then he turned his back on us. Samuel said, put away the false gods. These are not real. You're not supposed to be serving them. These are things that belong to the nations around you, and you serve Jehovah God only. Prepare your hearts to serve him, and then you'll be preparing your hearts for a victory. And of course, there was a great victory. And after the victory, in chapter 7 and verse 12, we read that at the location of the victory, Samuel set up a stone which was named Ebenezer. Now, the name Ebenezer in the literal sense means stone of help. And the statement that Samuel made as he sets up that stone as a reminder, as a memorial, as recognition of what God had done for them, he said, thus far the Lord has helped us, indicating again to the people, this is why you want. And there that stone would be as a memorial for a long time to remind people that the Lord helped them to be where they were right then. And along with that was a reminder in the future, if you turn to God, he'll turn to you. If you turn away from God again, he'll turn away from you again. But at least at this point, thus far, the Lord has helped us. To those of you who may be familiar with that song that we often sing, O thou fount of every blessing, there's a line in there in which we sing to the Lord, here I raise my Ebenezer. And perhaps we've never thought a lot about what we were saying when we sang that, but what we're doing is singing about the same attitude that Samuel is indicating here with this stone of help. We're saying, Lord, you brought us this far. You've helped us to accomplish this. And we remember that just as sure as there were a stone among us. We're remembering the Lord's help. the fount of every blessing. And we're saying, Lord, this represents a stone of help. We know that you brought us to where we are, a recognition of the Lord's power and the Lord's care for his people. After this victory, Samuel assumed his activities as the judge and led the people in a good way. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went from year to year on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and judged Israel in all those places. But he always returned to Ramah, for his home was there. And if you recall chapter 1, that was the hometown of Samuel, and the place where the story of his mother Hannah and all of that began, which starts the story that we're looking at in this lesson. His circuit was including these particular towns right here in a particular way. It would seem that people would come to him from other parts of Israel as judgments needed to be made, as the will of the Lord needed to be discerned. And Samuel would share that with them at these particular places here, as you see they're located in basically the southern part of Israel, the territory of Israel, however, extending up and further southward as far as his judging. He was judge, remember, of all Israel, from Dan to the north to Beersheba in the south. Well, thank you for joining us for this study. And Lord willing, in our next lesson, in lesson 3, we'll be looking at chapters 8 through 15. And we'll be looking at them in a way as we've looked at this lesson, looking at the high points, because we have a lot of chapters to cover in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We need to cover a good bit of material each time that we cover it in order to stay on schedule. What we want to remember as we think about these events in the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel is that God's presence makes a difference between victory and defeat. The Israelites started out with defeat in a physical sense. We might also say they were really defeated in a spiritual sense. God was not with them because they were not following God. However, as Samuel took over, the attitude, the atmosphere, spiritual atmosphere changed, and they experienced both a physical victory and a victory spiritually as they returned to where they should have been. And right along beside this, and very closely connected to this, we learn that the right leader is often the difference, especially for Israel, in whether they depended on God or whether they neglected God. And that's still, of course, true with God's people today. The leadership can make a great difference. The people before Samuel took over, as they saw the behavior of Hophni and Phinehas, and saw that Eli did not rebuke them until it was actually too late, that resulted in all of Israel going in a direction in which God was not honored, and instead Ashtoreths and Baals and perhaps other deities of the pagan nations there were worshipped, and that resulted in tragedy and disaster for them. So it's a lesson of having God with us makes a difference in victory and defeat, and the difference that takes place is sometimes due to the leadership that is offered. We see that in Samuel and these first few chapters of this book that bears his name. So hope you'll be with us for our next lesson. Again, that'll be chapters 8 through 15 of 1 Samuel. We appreciate you being with us.